The Freelancers, along with the Sentinels, Guardians of the Walls, protected Freemark and its people from the chaos of our world.
So we once again return to Bastion, this time with the final release on both the Xbox One X and the Pro. I'll be covering the base models, the PS4 and the Xbox One S, a little later, but I wanted to get this video out with the day one patch applied. And just if my previous look at the demo analysis has shown up or highlighted any drastic changes. Well, the first thing is, yes, they've certainly made improvements, and if you remember back when my release and I covered the demo version, I did state on the original Xbox One S and the X that an adaptive VSync may help improve the performance levels and the input controller response, and that's exactly what they've done on that version. I'm assuming it's the same on the S. They've turned on an adaptive VSync which allows the top quarter, maybe tenths to tear, so you get a few tears every now and then during play and then a dip usually. Now, it doesn't tear all the time. In fact, for my tested sections here, overall around 10 to 12 minutes worth of tested action, it's 15 to 18% of the frames are torn. But as you can see, it also dips occasionally as well. So this is only helping out when it's a couple of milliseconds over that budget of 33. Which it goes beyond that, it allows the screen to tear. Now in traversal and action in the opening, very linear section, it's much better than when you get out into the open world, obviously. And again, just like the demo, the interior sections in Bastion and the city and then outside in the open outer world, they are very different and they perform differently. The biggest drawback is GPU bound title heavily overall, but they have optimized or improved some of the things that we covered and I covered in depth on the original demo analysis, so I'm not going to repeat that here. Much of that still stands though. This is still, as I say, an early release. It's not final or ready for public consumption in my opinion. There's many elements here where it's been rushed out of the door, and that's not to say it's a bad game, but it's not just performance that really shows all of this, it's also the gameplay, which I'll touch on a little later in the video. So from the demo we saw a 3840 by 2160 count. Now with more time looking at more counts and looking at the real-time cinematics, we can see that this is actually a dynamic solution here, running 3840 by 2160 a lot of the time, but dipping down to 3456 by 1944, around 81% of that 4K output screen. Again, checkerboard is a possibility. Problem with motion blur, post effects and things like that, this all ends up looking like checkerboard because most of these effects are reduced shader scaling, so they don't render the whole shading pass on the actual geometry or the actual buffer size fully. They actually usually use that and the TAA and the motion blur. They're classic examples of where you can cut back on the shading cost, which is very expensive in the pipeline, and that's why when you turn motion blur on, when you turn chromatic aberration on, it tends to highlight and exacerbate that checkerboard solution. In fact, they even covered this in their very own talk about checkerboard rendering, that everything looks like checkerboard once you turn on post-processing. So this is likely an element here. At the end of the day, these all need to hide the fact that you can't see it when it renders to the final output. So from these early tested sections, the Xbox One X looks much better than what we saw in the original demo. And the PS4 Pro is even better. Now, I'm not saying that the PS4 is the same, like I say, I'll cover the base versions, but this doesn't run an adaptive VSync, and it actually performs better on average, not a huge amount here, but it certainly performs better than the Xbox One X. I never covered the demo, but here we're seeing again a checkerboard most likely solution here with a dynamic scaler running at 3840 by 2160 right down to 3200 by 1800, so that's around 69% of a 4K screen. Back on the original demo it was an unlocked frame rate, but here it's now capped fully at 30 FPS or 33 milliseconds, and that means we see a more consistent delivery of frames, but we don't see any tearing at all. Now it might run an adaptive VSync, but in the same tested sections here between the X and the Pro, I'm not seeing any tearing, so I'm inclined to believe the performance headroom is slightly better on the Pro, therefore they don't need to turn this on, or at least it never engages, so you get a fully VSync title, or a skip into the next 16 milliseconds refresh cycle, giving you 50 milliseconds when it dips.
Nasty, lots of them, hurry!
So like I say, these opening sections do show a much better performing title on Pro in the X, with the Pro coming out on top ever so slightly. These cutscenes suffer on both, with these dips as it jumps between geometry load, shader passing and context switches, most likely from these cutscenes here, where you get those sudden judders into 100 or 150 milliseconds, but they are in real-time cinematics, so it's not a huge issue. Now what does change the two versions is the Xbox One X and the Pro do look significantly different on a 4K screen, and that's, I think, down to the fact that the Pro is using a different level of reconstruction elements on it, and also the shading past the AO, they don't look as good, and the temporal AA is certainly not as strong. We keep saying this a lot now, so it's quite clear that the memory increase that's available on the X helps out in these areas, and temporal AA, any kind of AA, is one of the areas where memory also helps. It's not just throughput, and I mentioned this way back before the console launch, so we see this time and time again, and this means that looking at these two side by side, as you can see examples of here, it's quite clear that both versions look excellent. Don't get me wrong. Visually, there's loads of beautiful particle effects, alpha effects, great volumetric lighting in certain sections, lots of long view distances, heavy loads of overdraw, pretty decent LOD, shader effects on the water, screen space reflections aren't in use here. You only see those when you're inside Bastion. That's the same as the original demo. And that voxel based grid that the light source is used for the volumetric lighting, it's there, it's present on both versions, it's there on the base version, it looks very good. Again though, it looks better on the X than it does on the Pro, slightly higher resolution, slightly more stable, so that depth grid doesn't look quite as unstable as it does on the Pro. You can see it here in side-by-side comparisons. But overall, the visual quality is much sharper and cleaner on the X. You can definitely see it. Foliage, AO, shadow maps, they all highlight a better and clearer and more stable image on the X than we see on the Pro. It was the lead platform. It is a native 4K, at least the output counts at 4K on geometry, whatever they're doing on their temporal passes. Like I say, checkerboard rendering is not just geometry, it's about everything else that's going on. That's the most important part, isn't the geometry, it's the shading past, the texture quality, the taps, the filtering, all those elements add a lot more. And here, the alpha effects, the GPU accelerated particle systems, they all put extra load on the GPU, and this title is stressed into the GPU on every machine that it runs, and this means that performance can suffer on both machines. So moving into performance, covering the original beta, or the demo that we saw way back on the 2 weeks ago now, or 3 weeks ago now, on the PS4 Pro and the PS4, I never had time to put my video up on this, but you can see here that it ran an unlocked frame rate. Comparing it and dropping the resolution down to 720p, 1080p and 4K, we can see that the engine doesn't render any lower than 1080p, 720p doesn't make any difference, but you can see inside the cityscape it does run very close to 60 FPS. And it runs better out in the open world, but it's not a 60 FPS title. I did say it when I covered the X version. So having this option in the menu screen would be nice, and maybe with some more optimization later, patches and changes in a few months time, they could add an additional element here to actually unlock the frame rate and run it at 1080p. But as it stands, just like the demo, you don't have the choice to flip to a 1080p mode. You have to force it. So the way you do that is you have to quit the game, go into the menu system and turn 1080p on your rendering system, and that way it forces 1080p out to your TV. If it's a 4K screen, it'll then upscale that to 4K. If it's 1080p screen, then bang on. And you end up with a native 1080p image. Again, that lack of AA is there, so it actually, again, exacerbates all of the issues that I've just mentioned. So aliasing obviously stands out much more, AO shadows and breakup on there, and the dithering passes on the foliage and the alpha effects, they all add up, so it looks worse on a 4K screen and pretty good on a 1080p one, very close to what we see on the PS4. So that's a good option, and it does give you a completely locked, from all my tested sections here, locked 30 FPS. There's no issues there at all. The issue is, I don't feel that having this cap to 30 in place now and dropping to 1080p with the performance metrics I'm looking at here on the Pro, that it's worth the sacrifice to image quality even on a 1080p screen. It does make the image look less sharp, more shimmery, and certainly far more noisy than that dynamic output that we get that goes to a 4K screen. Yes, there are dips, there are jitters, and you still get some loading stutters and sector points in the game as you're jumping between certain areas, and it's still quite open, but it's not resolved fully. So in combat you may notice these dips that you get, which you can see side by side examples here of the X and the Pro. But the Pro is close enough, I think, for me to still have that sacrifice. But if you are really offended by some of the dips that you get in the title, and there might be some worse points later on, then it looks like forcing that 1080p solution on the Pro is again a win. Within, which I covered way back when the consoles were launched. If you go back to my Evil Within 2 video, I covered that in depth. Well, that actually offered a 60 FPS mode that was actually worthwhile on the Pro, and you couldn't have that option at all on the X. So it is a benefit to the system, even if, in my opinion, it's not worth the sacrifice to image quality at this point. It's great that that option is there, but it'd be good for BioWare to add that into the menu option and just allow the user to flick it to 1080p mode and just call it performance mode, and then you'll get a pretty much, as I've tested here, locked 30 FPS in all sections. They may be able to get down to that 60 FPS that they attempted in the demo, but I wouldn't hold my breath, and realistically there's a lot more going on here, so that'll be months away in my opinion if they ever got round to that point. So the X and the Pro in main combat action here, side by side, we see a similar example of what we saw in the opening sections. It's certainly worse. It can dip a lot more down into the, the mid-25s occasionally, even into the low 20s. It's a double buffer VSync again, so you still get those hangs into 20 FPS or 50 milliseconds, give or take, consistently, so that can affect the performance. It runs worse on the X than the Pro very slightly. It looks better and sharper on the X than the Pro very slightly, so you pick your poison at the end of the day. I wouldn't class either as a solid performer, but it's certainly better than the demo, but there is room here for improvement, and hopefully they'll do that. The performance metrics are all down below in the description, and obviously my real-time tool analysis here, you can see them as we go through. My opinion, the game isn't great. It's not for me, that's for sure. I don't enjoy it. I don't think it's good. I think the story is a bit poor. I think the storyline and the process, it's almost this beginning section where the guy winks at you and talks to you like you're an 8-year-old. I don't like that. It kind of puts me off the game. And I feel as if it's not playing to an older generation of audience, and that's fine. It's going out for the Destiny audience, and that's its aim, and that makes sense. But for me, it isn't the plan or the path that I would want the Anthem title to take. The world looks beautiful. All the particle effects, the lovely draw distance, the atmospheric scattering, the volumetric lighting, the character models, and I must say, I did cover the Anthem demo, VIP demo, and what we've seen here. And the real-time cutscenes, I've certainly ramped up that quality, so the facial animation in the characters is certainly at the level of that original reveal, even if once you're out in the cityscape the quality is nowhere near what it was in that original reveal. So I'm still leaning on the fact that that was a pre-rendered cutscene, and the game is full of pre-rendered cutscenes, which is one of the downsides because they look quite poor. You get elements where you got lots of film grain, the quality is lower than the 4K screen on the X. So these sections stand out like a sore thumb because they look much lower quality than what the real-time cinematics do. So again, I've mentioned that before in my original demo. I feel like I'm repeating myself over again to nausea, so apologies for that. Essentially, it isn't a game that I will play and I enjoy. I will be covering the base versions, but I think this doesn't live up to the expectations that many had, simply because the world is huge, vast, and has loads of depth both vertically and horizontally, but there's not a lot in it. It's very empty, it's very bland, it's very boring. There's lots of sections where bugger all happens. There are some great, they've got the fight here with the Rancor monster. This game really doesn't hide itself very well, being heavily influenced by Star Wars. Attack walkers are everywhere, Rancors are coming in for battles, and there are some great elements in the title, and visually it's brilliant. The team have worked really hard to create a believable universe and lore that many may like. If you're much younger than me, that's absolutely fine. Me personally, I find it a bit dry, a bit bland, and a bit vanilla in terms of the story delivery, how it flows, the characters, the comedy that's in there, which is a bit excessive. All of those things don't really add up for me. But the combat, the controls, and the battle system in there is excellent. And I think the stylistic look of the characters themselves and how you can model them, change them to the material systems, the colours, all of that is brilliant, and I really like the look of the game. I just don't like the game itself. I would have loved to have seen a really strong emphasis on a linear story that this could have flowed through, really built characters and added a lot more to it. The character plot and development is all very similar, and it flows in a very easy way. Learn a person, a little bit more about the character, let the story unfold before you. It's just not that engaging. Adding a little bit of character and comedy here, and then go off, shoot these people, kill this killbox wave, turn this switch, go here. I've played it a million times. I don't really feel like playing it again, and that, unfortunately for me, is what really turns me off, outside of all the other issues that we've covered on the demo. This is much better than the demo, and they have made real big strides to improve the performance and the delivery, but it still suffers from loading, still suffers from keeping you in a very closed box when other people are playing. The fact that you can join a brand new mission you've never started before and actually join it halfway through and miss big sections of it is a bit of a shame for me. It should force you to start a level yourself, even if you start on your own and other people join you. It should be a much slower process than what it is. If somebody's played the missions before and they've gone back just to play them again to get extra treats, they can zip through the level like Billio, and you can't actually hang around and look at things. You're forced to run at their pace, and that makes the game difficult to enjoy if it's your first time playing it. Like I say, the engine systems and the restrictions are all very clear to what Battlefield has had. This is the DICE Frostbite engine for Battlefield, and it has all those limitations of memory streaming and allocations. Loading is still bad, it's still long on all versions, you still have to load mid-mission to go into caves, you still get drawn back and warped into other areas when you extend the mission zone, so all of those issues are still there, and that fundamentally affects the game itself, and that for me is why it's not a game for me. It looks great, it runs better, but it isn't really the Anthem that I expected it to be, and I think that overall is its biggest letdown. But hopefully it'll get enough legs, even though the EA have forced it out the door, to see a longer lifespan and much more improvement to the game and title overall. It would be good to see a much more fleshed out and realistic world with a lot more animals, enemies and things to do. Much more varied mission design, because this just feels lazy and boring, and within 3 missions I was already bored of flying around and shooting the same things over and over again. Respawning enemies was bad in the 80s. It's still bad now. Anyway, that's it for now. I hope you guys and girls enjoyed this and found it useful and informative. If you did, you can really help this channel grow and survive by subscribing, liking, clicking that little bell to make sure you get subscribed to all notifications, and sharing this and anything else that I do where appropriate, which helps improve my numbers, because YouTube, the algorithm itself, really isn't my best friend. And look at me, I'm a really nice guy. What more can you ask for? Anyway, that's it. I'm out, but I'll catch you on the next one.
Got it!